It was 5 a.m. a couple of days ago, and I was not able to fall back to sleep. And I was looking up at the ceiling, as I sometimes do, and I guess it is a professional hazard. I was thinking about how I wanted to frame what I said this morning. And here is where I landed. This is what I want to say at the beginning and at the end of my comments this morning. It is really this simple. We need to do what is right, not out of fear of other people's opinions, not because we feel we need to defend ourselves against other people's opinions. We need to do what is right because we have the integrity to do what is right. Now, you can play the game of where is the rabbi going with this, and I won't keep you in suspense. Many of you read, or many of you heard about, a column that was written recently in the New York Times by Nicholas Kristof, having to do with accusations of abuses taking place in Israeli prisons, Israelis abusing Palestinian prisoners. And responses within the Jewish community really ran the gamut. On one side, you had, we must confess and apologize to everyone for what is going on. On the other side, this article is full of lies. It is a blood libel against the Jewish people. The author should be fired. I examined responses by two journalists. I'm going to get specific, but not super specific, because you can look up further what each of them has to say that actually suggest a third response. And I'd like to play it out, showing you certain aspects of their argument, and then what I believe is the important steps that need to be taken. So two journalists in particular, whom I recommend, very thoughtful. They both came from the United States and Canada, respectively, and made Aliyah. Chaviv Redegur from the United States, Mati Friedman from Canada. And first thing that they argued is that there are aspects of this article that are deeply problematic from the perspective of journalism. The author relies on a particular NGO, a non-governmental organization, that has been biased toward Hamas for a long time. He relies on this NGO for information and for tips about who to interview. The interviews provide statements, some of which actually track with conspiracy theories that are put forth about Jews throughout the Middle East. And some, in fact, don't even track with the findings of basic science. So the first thing that they say is that the author is, instead of relying on his own investigative journalistic prowess, is relying on organizations that are starting with a very profound bias. They also point out that the timing of this article is not coincidental. So this was a day before Israel released the results of a civil investigation into systemic abuses of Israelis by Hamas on October 7th and following. And one of these journalists, Mati Friedman specifically, alleges that Kristof, the New York Times journalist, in timing his article for the day before the investigation into Hamas brutality came out, was trying to put forward a kind of equivalency, to suggest at the very least that the Israelis are doing the same thing and that they are behaving with hypocrisy. And, Friedman said, moreover, he gives the ability for people relying on this article to add to their arsenal of claim that Israel, in fact, deserved what happened on October 7th, 2023, by virtue of Israel's behavior. So that's all the first thing that they are claiming in terms of the journalistic process and integrity of the New York Times author. Second, Mati Friedman in particular has done a lot of research in how major newspapers, legacy newspapers, rather than relying on their own journalistic investigative processes, are becoming increasingly reliant upon these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, many of whom are biased, and that he has documented that over the past decade, there has been a large, well-funded effort on the part of these NGOs to delegitimize Israel. So that's second. Third, they both maintain, as journalists, as Israelis, that notwithstanding all of this, and notwithstanding that many of the claims in the article are either unsubstantiated or fly in the face of basic science, that nevertheless there is abuse going on in Israeli prisons, that nevertheless there are things that have been investigated and that require further investigation. So where does this leave Israel? And where does this leave those of us who care about Israel? Chaviv Redegur and Mati Friedman, and I'll add Daniel Hartman of the Hartman Institute and Yossi Klein Halevi, a long-standing journalist, all suggest some version of the following. While it is tempting to completely ignore everything that was said, tempting for Israel to say we have nothing to investigate, nevertheless, they believe that Israel should do what is right, and that Israel should conduct investigations into the allegations because that is the right thing to do. Now, having said all of that, I'll give you my perspective, having not been a journalistic expert, but having read and having seen much of what was put forth in response to the New York Times article, and also mindful of Jewish tradition. Here is what I want to share. So first, a little story. So Johnny is driving along the main street of his town, and he drives right through a red light, and he knows that he's driving right through a red light, and suddenly a police car that has been waiting on a side street turns the corner, emerges, the officer pulls Johnny over and asks Johnny, "Didn't you see the red light?" And Johnny says, "I saw the red light, officer. I just didn't see you." Ideally, we don't do the right thing because somebody is watching us. Ideally, we do the right thing because this is part and parcel of who we are, because we have a certain integrity, and because doing the right thing builds that integrity and ultimately gives us a kind of strength that is extremely unique. Now, approaching the same concept, there's an Israeli expression, and Hebrew is so beautiful and evocative and has thousands of years of nuance. So an Israeli will say to somebody whom they don't fully trust, and somebody that they feel they don't owe very much, lo me'uktzech ve'lo miduvshech. What does that mean? You're treating the person like they're a bee. I'm not afraid of your sting, and I don't need your honey. There is an English expression that has two words that suggests a similar idea. Really, the expression means, I am going to conduct myself the way I think is right. It is not because of anything you have said. It is not in order to please you. So here's what I believe. Israelis must call out explicitly any journalistic statements that are carelessly inaccurate or deliberately inaccurate, or even worse, part of a systematic effort to delegitimize Israel and Jews. And I hope that Israelis will continue to do that, and all of us who love Israel will continue to support their efforts in systematically calling out all such journalistic malpractice and worse. And folks, what is happening all over, but we've seen it in New York, around the block from the Park East Synagogue, and in other neighborhoods in New York City, is that there are people carrying Hamas flags and Hezbollah flags. These are not people who are trying to make Israel better. These are people who want Israel to completely disappear. The delegitimization campaign against Israel is real, and it requires pushback again and again and again. And we need to insist on accountability within our own ranks. We need to be prepared, not because of what someone wrote in the New York Times, but because we know what is right, to investigate and to distinguish that which is inaccurate and libelous from that which might be true. We need to do this. And maybe those people who are criticizing, who care about us, will be pleased that we did, but frankly, I care less about them than I care about us. We need to do this because we know it's the right thing, regardless of how others regard us, regardless of their honey, regardless of their sting. Just a few more thoughts from our tradition now. So the Haftarah this morning, it is about a young man who does what he knows to be right, even though he gets lambasted for it. Jonathan does what he knows to be right vis-a-vis David, even though his father calls him out in the starkest terms. And secondly, the whole parasha this morning is about accounting. Counting and accounting are similar. In Hebrew, lehipaked. At Camp Ramah, when the kids count off at the waterfront, na lehipaked. 1, 2, 3, they say in Hebrew. Accountability is hardwired into our tradition. We are accountable not because the people around us are asking to be, because that is part of our integrity, part of who we know ourselves to be. So to conclude, we have the right and the responsibility to push back against sloppy journalism and worse. We have the right and responsibility to push back when criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism and delegitimization, and it happens again and again. And we have the responsibility to hold ourselves accountable, not for fear of the sting of others, nor for the promise of their honey, but because holding ourselves accountable is the right thing to do. And from doing that again and again, we will gain an inner strength that nobody can destroy. Shabbat Shalom.